The surge in Iraq is working. Progress is being made. Those are the kinds of non-specific, generic, White House-approved impressions that the administration is allowing to leak to reporters about the new national intelligence estimate on Iraq. So why, in our fourth story on the countdown, is the administration now refusing to release the actual findings of the latest NIE, especially as they released the last two NIEs, and especially as the latest one, at least from the preliminary leaks, appears to support what General David Petraeus and Ambassador Ryan Crocker want the American people to believe when they testify to Congress next week. In anticipation of that testimony, Democrats are urging the administration to reconsider its position on the NIE. Senators Carl Levin and Edward Kennedy writing to the Director of National Intelligence, Mike McConnell, that, quote, without a current unclassified assessment of the situation in Iraq, Congress and the American people will not have the essential information needed for an informed public debate. And House and Senate leadership are already getting their debate points out ahead of next week's testimony, writing to President Bush to urge him to change his strategy in Iraq before he leaves the White House. Quote, we are deeply concerned that you and the congressional Republican leadership are intent on staying the current course throughout your administration and then handing the Iraq war off to future presidents, end quote. Regarding those future presidents, the current Secretary of Defense is apparently making promises on their behalf, telling reporters on his way to Oman that the United States intends to send additional troops to Afghanistan in 2009, even if troop levels in Iraq remain the same. I'm joined now by John Soltz. John is chairman of VoteVets.org. Thanks for your time tonight, John.
Great to be on with you on Countdown, Rachel.
Thanks. We'll get to the Afghan deployment issue in just a moment, John. But first, this refusal to declassify the NIE. How can the president expect the public to accept his version of what's happening in Iraq without allowing us to see any kind of independent assessment like we've had from these previous NIEs?
Well, it hurts. And it hurts people like me because when we fought on the ground in Iraq, we trusted this administration on WMD. There's 160,000 troops like myself, people who are just regular Americans serving on the ground in combat right now in Iraq, and the only voice that they have are people here at home. Maybe it's their families, their mothers, their fathers, maybe it's the representative in Congress. And they have a right to see this information right now, unclassified, so they can appropriately address General Petraeus next week when he testifies. Now, one of the reasons that people have been talking about as to why they won't release it is it's interesting. I mean, they're playing domestic politics with this intelligence report because it was only up till January, so it's a very limited NIE. It only deals with Iraq, and when you put that much combat troops in the ground, there's been better control of certain streets in Baghdad. But are they going to release it next week to try to back Petraeus and play politics with it? And I think that's a huge concern. They need to release it now because there's soldiers and Marines' lives that are at stake, and they are disgracing their service by being so secretive with America's information. And
in a democracy, the idea is that when a democracy goes to war, the citizenry is informed about why and how it's going and what the point is. John, do you expect that the testimony from General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker next week is going to be substantive and frank, or are you expecting White House PR?
Well, obviously it's White House PR because it is General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker. Now, that's not to say that they're going to lie. They're two very honorable men who deserve Americans' respect. But this is not about a couple streets in Baghdad. This is not about troops and tactics. And the question for Democrats next week and organizations like ours and VoteVets is we're going to broaden this debate. The fact of the matter is that Admiral Fallon retired because he was being undermined by a direct channel that the Iraq commander had to the White House. And so the fact of the matter is Admiral Fallon, who's concerned about Afghanistan, had to retire. So where is the CENTCOM commander? Where is the Secretary of Defense? Where's the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Casey, to say the Army can't hack this troop deployments anymore? So they're giving you a very limited scope, and that limited scope, will be honest, but they're not going to tell you is that George Bush and John McCain have our country in a policy of retreat. And people who served in the military, we're tired of it.
John, one last question for you. The Department of Defense told NBC News that they might divert troops who are training for Iraq into Afghanistan in 2009 instead. And the Secretary of Defense says there will be a ramp up in Afghanistan even if there isn't a ramp down in Iraq. And next week we've learned that the Pentagon will announce plans to shorten deployments from 15 months back to 12. So where are these extra tens of thousands of troops going to come from? And what are we looking at in terms of our overall military readiness?
Well, they're giving you political spin now because they're concerned about the fact that they know they've been playing defense and retreat from bin Laden. The fact of the matter is you have 42 active combat brigades in the United States Army. Your commitments in Iraq alone with the surge are about between 22, 23, 24, 25 brigades. So if you're a soldier in today's Army, you're either in Iraq, just coming home or getting ready to go. So the fact of the matter was, if you had taken the 5 combat brigades that you surged into Baghdad and put them in Afghanistan, you would have doubled your force structure. You can't do it all. We should have had more troops in Afghanistan the whole time, but I'm not concerned about Gates because he's not going to be the Secretary of Defense in 2009. And, you know, these guys are making promises now for domestic political purposes. They can't do it all. You can't lower troop levels and, you know, lower times of deployment and keep all your troops in Iraq and go to Afghanistan. They can't do it all. So they're just, once again, playing politics and not being honest.
As an American president famously said, the math doesn't work. John Soltz from VoteVets.org, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Rachel.